copy of the slides afterward, no trouble.
Cool.
Yeah, I'll be very happy to email anybody the slides.
Yeah, we did catch a typo and also expanded the print size on a couple of things. I don't know why it's showing up there, but it's disappearing. I don't know what that was.
I think it's chat or something.
All right, we are very nearly there. Just need to resize
Give
this.
us a minute.
The mirror and the mask. The mirror or the mask.
Or.
The mirror or the mask hidden in plain view.
First one was hidden in plain view,
Yeah,
and
2017.
the mask is the next one. Yes, for once I get to, threaten people with dire penalties if
Yes.
they say the mirror and the mask. When it happens with a host on a show, you just have to keep quiet and.
That'll be your segue.
All
Just
right.
so you know.
Yeah, right.
So,
I'm assuming some people are able to hear us on YouTube right now. Bear with us. We're still getting this all sorted out.
I saw Cody Nelson join up there. It said, had a notification Cody Nelson's joining this meeting.
There's another Rossio Christi post from 4 years ago that features Dr. Lydia McGrew on undesigned coincidences, which I'd be willing bet is also the same dress.
Nope.
No, it's not. Is this a new one?
No, it's a different one.
Okay.
It's even a different shade of red.
Oh, you know it then. You know. Okay, that's funny.
Oh yeah, I know which one that is because it comes up when I do a Google search.
Okay, that's funny.
That one had a sash. You can even see it.
Hey, go ahead and mute your audio.
It's on, supposedly.
Your volume, I mean. Yep, your volume.
What do I
On
need
the
to do?
computer.
Yep. So mute your output volume.
Mute it?
Yes.
Oh, great.
can do.
It's so confusing.
Just, there should be buttons right on the keyboard.
I think we did it.
Say
All
something,
right.
Lydia.
What?
Testing.
Testing. 1,
I was
2.
supposed to mute the audio.
Right, but your lapel mic should still work. It's the computer audio we wanted muted.
Are you on YouTube right
Oh,
now?
I see. Okay.
Okay, so this is what
Did
you're
I
doing.
do what I was supposed to do?
Yes, we did.
Okay. Or
Kyle.
did Kevin do what he was supposed to do?
You're getting any audio from YouTube.
Mhm.
Oh, well, my audio was-
Because the question is,
Yeah, I think so.
Lydia, go ahead and say something.
Testing.
Hello. How is
Nothing
that
to there?
working? No? Yes?
Okay.
Sound coming through or not, Tom?
No, I don't think so. It's,
All
I mean,
right,
my sense system kind of is.
I'm going to
screwed
go
up.
ahead and I think the sound, is going to come through here.
Okay, so this audio's not working?
Right, I saw Cody saying that the sound came on for a second, but
Yeah,
now it's
that
off.
was when I unmuted myself.
Okay.
So what we're gonna do is go ahead and move this apparatus / contraption up here.
Should I take this
And
one off?
the micro along with it, yeah, because that's not doing anything right now.
Okay.
That's a good mic, so it should.
Yeah, it'll pick up just fine.
Okay.
I'm going to go ahead and,
As long as people know that we're getting things.
all right, yep.
Kevin, are you going to mention in the beginning to send questions to me
I'm just gonna say, put them
in the chat? Okay, that's fine.
Whoa, coming down. Good catch.
Nice.
Good catch.
Oh, my bad, let me move this off.
No, it wasn't you.
Okay.
We're
How's
fine.
that? So then that's my audio over there.
Yeah, pretty much. So just as long as you project like normally, it should be fine.
Should I say something? Test it.
You want to sit right here?
All right, go ahead and test it.
Testing. Except that we're getting a feedback loop.
Well, that might be me.
I think it's
Oh,
you.
wait, no, it's not.
Make sure your audio's off.
It's off. Yeah.
Testing. It's yours, Kyle.
So it's,
Testing.
hang on. Why did I hear it coming from over here?
That was Kyle's computer, but.
No, it was your computer I heard it coming from.
All right, go ahead and try again.
Could be here.
Yeah, it's there.
I hear it back there.
It's not mine.
On Earth? Well, this is weird.
Spiritual warfare, everybody.
Yeah, right.
secure event becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands.
Fourscore and 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth in this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty. That, oh, you know what? Did we put the WebEx to the other audio?
What?
Didn't we slave WebEx to the audio that?
We did, but it doesn't matter because he's picking it up entirely independently.
Okay,
Yep.
all right.
All right, but you are getting it through YouTube?
Is it feeding it in?
My computer just sucks, so I can't tell.
Fourscore and 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth in this continent. Does anyone have a way of testing it?
All right, hang on.
In the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God. All things were made by Him.
Thanks for bearing with us, everyone.
I don't know why you're quoting from that. I hear that's a pretty unreliable document.
Yeah, yeah. So I am told. Reliably.
Right, yeah.
All right.
Hang on. I'm gonna go ahead and pull it up on my phone here and see if it works.
Okay, I'll try.
So you mean it might be working, but we can't tell?
At this point, it's hard to test anything through my computer because my computer is presenting.
I got a computer.
What about Thomas's computer?
My audio doesn't work, ironically.
Oh.
So.
There are forces arrayed against us.
Yes, devil's trying to stop us.
We wrestle not against
But he's
flesh and blood.
We're good. What's the,
Is there a reason for this to be?
Hey, Kevin, go ahead and see if you can open the link, the YouTube link on your phone.
Okay.
My internet is not being my friend right now.
I'm gonna hit record right when we start.
Okay.
Ask.
Forgot my holy water.
Okay, I see the screen.
So are we going to be
So it's a
using?
WebEx of this. It's
Okay.
not the camera. That's what it looks like on YouTube.
Okay.
Alright, can you turn the volume up and see if it's
That's
coming through?
because I'm doing share screen. But how are they hearing me?
So say something.
Fourscore and 7 years ago, our fathers
Apparently,
brought forth in this continent.
apparently it's very quiet on YouTube. I'm trying to figure out why that would be the case.
Mic just need to be turned off.
Let's get as close as
The
we
closer
can.
you can move it, the better it'll.
All right, let's try that. Is that better?
Testing, testing.
Is that better?
Volume wise, guys.
Any commentators saying anything?
Testing.
We moved the microphone closer.
Will it make it to the table or no?
Alright, let's go ahead. Hang on. There's quite a lag. Let's try this.
Between what we say here and what.
Maybe more volume from there now, I guess.
Can you do that in software settings, Kyle? Maybe.
Okay, are we getting through at all is the question to me.
I think it's quiet. It's very, so I think yes.
I have a pretty loud voice, but
Not loud enough.
Squeak up.
hey.
That was pretty funny.
I can always sleep outside for a night or something.
Right. As long as you get the laugh, right.
Yeah.
Okay, are we getting through at all?
Alright.
Okay, Cody says the sound on the WebEx is great.
Yep, so sound on OBS should be fine now.
Okay.
So the sound in general should be great?
Sound in general should be great.
Okay, at least
Good
on
to
the
go.
Cody says the sound on the WebEx is good, but softer on the YouTube.
Okay, somebody's gonna have to go click that thing
I'm counting on Kevin.
I'm going to.
Right, yeah.
That second from the right, that's this, I think, right? This camera.
That's correct,
Facing
but
over.
if we want people to be able to see your PowerPoint, we're just gonna have to do it with this for your PowerPoint right now, so what I'm gonna do is this. And there.
Okay. We ready to go? Oh, and Cody says the sound on YouTube is better now. You can always count on Cody.
We
He's
good,
great.
I think?
He's
Thank
like,
you, Cody.
way to go, Cody. All right.
Just want to make sure that camera's catching everything.
It is.
Just so you know, Cody, everybody can see your comments here on our big screen. All the people sitting here in the room. All right. Anyway.
We ready?
All right.
Click record and launch it, guys.
Hit record and launch it.
Kyle?
Yep, go ahead and start.
Exit out of it.
It won't stop it?
It won't.
Good. Welcome everyone to Ratio Christi at Western Michigan University. My name is Kevin West. I'm the chapter director here for our chapter. Welcome to our first, we're trying to do an in-person meeting for the first time this semester, so we're excited to be here on Western's campus. To those of you tuning in online, thank you for bearing with us on some technical difficulties. I think we're good to go now. We are blessed and excited to have Dr. Lydia McGrew with us today. Lydia is a wife, a mother. She's a widely published analytic philosopher. She's the author of 2 books, the latest being Mirror or the Mask. And then in 2017, she published one called Hidden in Plain View. So we're excited to have Lydia, and I'll turn it over to her. Oh, and also, if you have questions, there will be a Q&A time at the end of Lydia's talk. So type your questions in on the chat, and we'll have somebody fielding those for you. And so I give you Dr. Lydia McGrew.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you to Kevin and to Kyle and remotely to Cody for advising us, and to Thomas, yes, Thomas, for helping us to get this up and running, because we've got it running in 3 different ways: in person, on WebEx, and on YouTube. So that's been complicated for these guys. So I really appreciate that. I want to talk tonight about what is gospel reliability and why is it important. This is part 1 of a 3-part series. So I'm going to be back here next week to talk about how you can know that the Gospels are reliable. And then the following week, I'm going to be back to talk about the book of Acts and giving a talk called Acts Gets Hard Things Right, which will be similar to one that I gave at the National Conference of Christian Apologetics a week or 2 ago. So these will kind of form a series that has, I think, a certain amount of important unity to it. The talk I'm giving tonight is a new one for me. So we'll hope that that goes well. So let's start. Okay. Doesn't want to shift to my next slide. All right,
Support guy.
hitting the, we wrestle not against flesh and blood.
But against computers.
Computers, which is much worse than flesh and blood.
All right.
So when I'm hitting that, it's not going to the next. Now it is.
Yeah.
What? It just needed you? My husband's magic touch. Yay! All right. What do I mean when I talk about gospel reliability? Now, the reason I say what do I mean is because different people do use this term differently. Although, obviously, I think that you should use the term the same way that I do. So when I talk about what do I mean, I'm saying that because, others will come in and say, well, that's not what real reliability is, or did you, I actually had someone on Facebook, did you give a dictionary definition of paraphrase? And it's like, I'm trying to communicate a concept that I think is important. And I'll be explaining why I think this concept is important. So let's start out by defining the concept in question. Now, you'll see as I talk tonight that what I say could be applied to a secular document too, or to a person. So it's not some kind of special Christian concept of reliability just for the Gospels. It's going to be a broadly applicable historical concept of reliability. Well, first of all, let's talk about minimal reliability. And in some ways, this is based on the work of a secular probability theorist named John Earman. So minimal reliability, the fact that something is asserted by the source provides some evidence for it, just any evidence at all. So the source is not valueless. That's in informal terms. If you are a probability nerd, this corresponds, and you've studied a little probability, this corresponds to what probability nerds would call a top-heavy Bayes factor. And I'm not going to talk more about that right at this moment, but if you want to ask me to say more about it in the Q&A, I can. More often, I'm talking about gospel reliability. I'm talking about high reliability, saying that something is highly reliable. Now, I'm going to have some qualifications that I'll get to in a second, but with those qualifications in place, if a source is highly reliable, then this means that if something is asserted by that source or in that source, it provides strong evidence for it, not just some maybe very weak evidence, but strong evidence for it. Here's the bonus for probability nerds on that one. This would correspond to a very top-heavy Bayes factor. So here are some qualifications. First of all, there are going to be types of statements for which even a highly reliable source's trustworthiness is going to be less than for other types of statements. Why would this be? Well, maybe even though that is a highly reliable source, for this type of statement, he's going to have more trouble getting access to it. Maybe he's going to be conjecturing somewhat. He's not going to have direct access. He's going to have to ask someone else or something like that. So an example here would be contrasting a statement about an external fact with an attribution of motive. So if a military history source says that a battle took place on a certain day in a certain place, that's an external fact. But if he says it took place there because the general was concerned that if he waited, he would lose the advantage, then that latter statement is a statement about the internal content of the general's mind, and the military historian is going to be probably coming up with that by conjecture. He's going to have less access to that, or more indirect access to it. So that's a qualification, that even within a highly reliable source, there will be some variation of the strength of the evidence that we get from the fact that something is asserted in that source. Here's another qualification. Even strong evidence for something can be overcome by independent evidence against it. Now, if we have a statement of something in a highly reliable source, and if it doesn't fall into one of those special categories where we want to kind of downgrade it a little bit because we think the author was speculating or something like that, that's pretty strong reason to believe it. But on the other hand, suppose we have another source that's just as reliable that asserts that it didn't happen. Well, obviously, we're going to have to take both of those into account, right? That would be counter evidence. So the fact that something is asserted in a highly reliable source is, all else being equal, a good reason to believe it, but all else is not always equal. Sometimes we decide later, okay, there was a problem there because somebody else contradicted it, or maybe because we have evidence that that kind of thing doesn't happen. There are times when a person you normally consider to be reliable says something and you kind of raise your eyebrows and you say, I have reason to believe that that's not true. And so you kind of question that. So those are qualifications to it. Nonetheless, if something is stated in a highly reliable source, we shouldn't be questioning it just out of the blue. We shouldn't just be saying, oh, I don't know, maybe it didn't happen, maybe it did. You must not think that source is very reliable if there's no special reason to be questioning that given this understanding in place, that's the concept of reliability that I think we should be working with, what does not count as reliability? Now, you may wonder why I'm asking this question. Well, one of the reasons I'm bringing up this question, what does not count as reliability, is because you'll hear some rather odd uses of the term. For example, you'll hear people say, and I didn't actually make a slide for this one, but you'll hear people say, there's reliable information in here. So they'll attribute the reliability to the information rather than to the source. And that's an interesting kind of ambiguity because what do we mean by reliable information? Like if the source isn't reliable, what do we mean by saying the information is? I suspect that what people mean when they say that is that the information is true. So, but to say information is true isn't really to say anything about reliability. A stopped clock is right twice a day. So if I look up and it says 3 p.m. on a digital clock, and I know there's something wrong with that digital clock, but it happens to be 3 p.m., I can say that is true, that it's 3 p.m., but nothing is reliable here. The clock isn't reliable, and I probably shouldn't say the information is reliable either, because as it moves on, it's going to be wrong. Okay, so you just hear these other uses, and interestingly, you even hear some Christians using the term reliable in some rather odd ways, even in debates. You go out there and you watch sometimes a debate titled, "Are the Gospels historically reliable?" And you might be surprised at some of the things that you hear the person say who's supposedly arguing for yes. And I'll give you some examples here. Here's one. This source contains a lot of historical information. Is that an assertion that the source is highly reliable? No. That could be the case with a historical fiction or legend. It could contain even a lot of historical information. I'm a big fan of some books by an author named Edith Pargeter. She likes to write about the history of Wales, 700s to the 1200s, and even into the 1300s. She writes great historical novels. She does a lot of research. She's good at her research, and her novels contain a lot of historical information. Nonetheless, they are not original historical sources, and I would never cite them as reliable historical sources. At the most, they might serve as a jumping off point where I would say, I wonder if that really happened. That's really interesting, and then I'm going to go research it in other ways. So to say that it contains a lot of historical information is not to say that it's reliable. Another way of stating this one would be to say we can get quite a bit of historical information out of this source. That again is not saying that the source is reliable. Now, I bring this up, if you go back to the year 2012 and you search on YouTube, you'll find a pair of back-to-back debates that Dr. Craig Evans did up in Canada, at a university in Canada, with Bart Ehrman, the well-known skeptical scholar. And they did the same debate 2 nights in a row. It's really interesting to see. They had slightly different venues, I believe, but in the same town, I think it was. And but it was, they did similar opening statements, similar closing statements. Bart asked somewhat different questions, and it was kind of cool. I've watched them both all the way through at this point. And here was Dr. Evans supposedly defending the yes position on are the Gospels historically reliable, and he kept saying this kind of stuff. The Gospels contain a lot of historical information. We can get a lot of historical information out of them. And he cited a scholar named E.P. Sanders, a New Testament scholar, not generally considered a particularly conservative scholar, and listed a bunch of propositions about Jesus that are true, that are in the Gospels, we can get out of the Gospels. He was baptized by John the Baptist. He caused a disturbance in the temple. He clashed with the religious rulers. He was crucified, and this kind of thing. And when you looked at the whole list, you were kind of like, that really just doesn't sound all that impressive. Yay for E.P. Sanders. He didn't think Jesus was just a myth. He thought there were some things we could know about him. But it's really odd that Dr. Evans seems to think that this is the yes answer to are the Gospels historically reliable. And believe me, Bart Ehrman pointed that out. Because when you say these things, does that mean that you're willing to count on or accept or depend upon the source statements, even all else being equal, even if it's just a statement, Jesus went to this town. It doesn't even have to be a miraculous statement. If it's found in that document and you say it contains a lot of historical information, does it follow that you're just going to accept that? No, of course it doesn't follow. It contains a lot of information, but this might not be part of the true information that it contains. What else? This source gives us the big picture about the subject. Is that an assertion of reliability? Well, it's fuzzy. On the face of it, it might correspond to a belief in reliability because it might merely mean that the source is not infallible. It might be merely a way of saying, well, it might contain some things that aren't true, but here or there, but the vast majority of the material in it is true. Is that all that we mean when we say the source gives us the big picture? Well, again, as used in New Testament scholarship, that's not usually what that means. More often, especially in the context of Gospels scholarship and historical Jesus scholarship, a statement like that means something like that the source contains truth and falsehood, in fact, quite a lot of falsehood, brought about sometimes by errors and sometimes by deliberate change, sometimes by embellishment, and including an embellished story, but it gives us the big picture. I'll give you more illustrations of what that means. The scholar will end up defining the big picture in such a broad sense that everything below the highest level of generality is fuzzy. So, suppose that we'll go back to our military history example. Suppose that you are a military historian and you're writing about a certain general who fought in World War II. And you say that you find that this military historian is talking about battles that this general fought. And it lists many different battles, and it gives details, the terrain, and how the battles were lost and won, and what day they were fought, and approximately how many soldiers were opposed to him, and how many soldiers he had, troops he had, and the maneuvers and this kind of thing. A lot of military history facts. And then someone else comes along and reads that source and says to you, well, really, it's really hard to tell whether these battles took place at these places and these times, and even with these approximate numbers of troops involved and so forth. But we can conclude from it that this general fought a lot of battles against the Germans in France. Full stop. Is that person evaluating this as a reliable source? No, because he's describing it at this extremely high level of generality, even though the source contains a lot more information than that. He's putting a question mark over that information. Let me give you some examples of this. The big picture. Now, this slide was broken up a little bit. The way it was originally, you could tell that it was all one quote. So this is a quote. All right, if the nearly universal consensus of scholars is correct that Jesus' earliest followers remembered him as a miracle worker and exorcist, he very likely performed acts that led to these memories. Of course, that is not to say we can know those acts were divine miracles and exorcisms, nor is it to say the events occurred precisely as described in the Gospels. It is to say that there are probably historical events that lay behind many of the stories of miracles and exorcisms we read in the Gospels, even many of those holding that some of the stories have been substantially revised and embellished, maintain that historical kernels lay behind them. That is evangelical scholar Michael Licona in his book, Why Are There Differences in the Gospels, page 118. So this sounds a lot like our person evaluating the military historian and saying, well, there are historical kernels behind some of these stories of battles. Now you might ask, well, okay, can we at least know which battles specifically in this document there are historical kernels lying behind? Probably not, according to this evaluation. Let me give you a quotation from the same scholar from a different book on approximately the same topic. Historians may conclude that Jesus performed acts that he and others interpreted as miracles and exorcisms, and that these acts caused many onlookers to drop their jaws in amazement. However, it is difficult to award historicity with a great deal of certainty to any particular miracle or exorcism reported in the Gospels. Now, this is sounding a lot more like the person who says, well, this guy, he fought some battles with the Germans in France, right? But we're not sure about any of the particular battles. In a similar manner, the same quotation continued, historians may conclude that subsequent to Jesus' death by crucifixion, a number of his followers had experiences in individual and group settings that convinced them Jesus had risen from the dead and had appeared to them. We may affirm with great confidence that Peter had such an experience in an individual setting, and we will see that the same may be said of an adversary of the church named Paul. We may likewise affirm that there was at least one occasion when a group of Jesus' followers, including the 12, had such an experience. Did other experiences reported by the Gospels occur as well, such as the appearances to the women, Thomas, the Emmaus disciples, and the multiple group appearances reported by the tradition in 1 Corinthians 15, 3-7, and John? Where did these experiences occur? Historians may be going beyond what the data warrants in assigning a verdict with much confidence to these questions. I reiterate that historians may conclude that subsequent to Jesus' execution, a number of his followers had experiences in individual and group settings that convinced them Jesus had risen from the dead and had appeared to them in some manner. This conclusion is granted by a nearly unanimous consensus of scholars and may therefore be added to our historical bedrock. Again, that's Dr. Licona. That's from his book on the resurrection of Jesus. This, again, is not asserting reliability. Because if you're asserting reliability, you're not just describing it at this very high level. They had some kind of experiences, some kind of appearances, and we can't even be sure if any of the particular, ones recounted there happened. Okay? So in the Gospels, of course, you find particular times when Jesus appears to his disciples. This is just saying that one or the other of those happened. Some such, but not the particular one. Thanks, I think. This is not affirming gospel reliability. In fact, I will go farther. This is casting a significant question on gospel reliability. Because when you say that to affirm a particular miracle is to go beyond what the data warrant, to affirm a particular appearance that's recounted in a particular account in the Gospels is to go beyond what the data warrant, you're saying that the fact that it appears there doesn't warrant it. Now, in my book, The Mirror or the Mask, Kevin was listing my books, I used the phrase casting doubt on the resurrection accounts to describe this way of talking. And I had someone in an email exchange tell me he took issue with that wording and said, you shouldn't say that this is casting doubt on the resurrection accounts because this scholar, Dr. Licona, is affirming the resurrection appearances. Accounts, appearances. You see the difference? See the difference? I said I was very clear about that. I was extremely explicit about that in The Mirror or the Mask. I made a distinction between affirming that there were some kind of appearances and affirming the accuracy of the accounts. It's possible to affirm that there were some kind of thing that corresponds in some way to this description, and it's like a disjunction, what scholars call a disjunction, either this or this or this or this, or something like this at a very high general level took place while casting doubt on the accounts. Okay. This grants so much skepticism about the contents of the documents and accounts and describes events that historians can know at such a high level of generality that it does not amount to the documents as reliable. Now, I want to talk a little bit about how multiple attestation functions here. The term multiple attestation is used by historical Jesus scholars to describe a situation where you have more than one document, or they might think more than one source lying behind the documents that tells the same story or gives the same saying of Jesus or something like that. Usually they don't ascribe multiple attestation when there's just multiple people who are asserting something, like it'll say in a document that multiple people asserted it, they'll ascribe multiple attestation when multiple written sources or conjectured written sources supposedly say something. Now, I'm not saying anything against multiple attestation. Multiple attestation is great. In fact, quite a bit of my professional work has involved working on multiple testimony. So a lot of my publications have had to do with multiple testimony to an event. When you have 3 witnesses or something that all say that something happened, when is that better than having only one? How do we decide that they're sufficiently independent, that they're not colluding with one another, they're not copying from one another, and so forth. And so I've done a lot of work on this, and the fact is that it's great if you can get multiple people who are sufficiently independent of one another all saying the same thing. That is going to multiply very quickly to very high probability for the event. When Tim and I have argued for the resurrection, we do it with people. We talk about the number of people who asserted that they had had experiences of Jesus being risen from the dead and so forth, and we do it that way rather than with written sources. So nothing to say against multiple attestation. And sometimes there are events that are multiply attested in the Gospels. For example, the feeding of the 5,000 is found in all 4 of the Gospels. And you can find differences between those accounts too that really look like these are different, perspectives on it. They give different details and so forth. But if you require multiple attestation before accepting an account, even when there's nothing especially unlikely about the event or especially problematic about the author's access to it, you are not treating that source as reliable. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, what I mean by that is something like this. You have a situation where one gospel says that something happened, okay? And a scholar comes along and says, well, this is found only in this document, so we can't really know that it happened. Then apparently that document doesn't weigh very much with you. If the fact that it's only in John causes you to put a big question mark over it, then you must not think very much of John. Think about how this would relate if you were talking about a person. All right? If Bethel comes and tells me something that has happened that day, and I say, well, I'm going to go ask your dad whether he saw that happen. I'm going to go ask somebody else whether he believes that actually happened. Then I must not think very much of her testimony, right? I mean, that's not too good. If you come and you tell me something and I say, really? I think that it would be going beyond what the data warrant for me to believe that until I've checked with somebody else. You're going to say, what am I, chopped liver? All right, that's how you're going to respond to that. You're not going to exactly consider that a compliment. Now, we get this happening in gospel scholarship all the time. So it looks like we've lost our stream or something. There's much coming and going. Does someone want to tell me what terrible thing has happened?
Oh, we're just plugging in my computer before we have an issue as opposed to waiting.
Okay, so this is preventative. Okay,
Just
cool.
the charger, right?
Okay, this is preventative. Good. All right. These are what I call unforced errors in gospel scholarship. So I'm going to give you just a couple of examples. Here's one from an interview that Dr. highly respected evangelical scholar Dr. Craig Keener did recently on a YouTube interview that he did. They were talking about an incident that's recounted in the Gospels, including the Gospel of Luke, where Jesus supposedly heals a man's hand that's withered up and he heals it. And Dr. Keener didn't question the miracle itself. Okay, so this isn't proceeding from an anti-miracle bias. But he was giving his host an example of what he believed that the authors would have considered themselves licensed to change. And so he said, only in Luke do we find the statement that it was his right hand. And he said, so Luke might have added that. And he clearly added it without historical warrant, because he mentioned as an alternative, well, Luke could have had another source for it, but he might have just considered that he was licensed to add it. Now, I mean, if you think about this, there's nothing particularly probable. It had to be one hand or the other. You know, even choosing at random, there's a 50% chance it's going to be the guy's right hand, okay? And Luke, we know, and I'll talk about this. If you come back for my series, I'm going to talk about the book of Acts and all the evidence we have of the carefulness of Luke as a historian. We know how careful he is, even about small details, but somehow when he goes to say that it was this guy's right hand, out of a clear blue sky, Dr. Keener is using that as an example of something that he could have just added. He didn't say he definitely did, but he just threw a question mark over it. And why? Because it's only on Luke. Okay? Now that's what I call an unforced error. Similarly, in the Gospel of John, we have an account of the religious leaders. They send messengers to John the Baptist saying, now this is just a conversation. This isn't even a miracle. It's just a conversation. They say, who are you? And why are you baptizing? And are you the Messiah? And all this stuff. They're trying to figure out. And he says, I am the voice of one crying in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord. That conversation occurs only in John's Gospel. In the Gospel of Mark, which is called a synoptic gospel, we find the narrator saying, the voice of one crying in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord. John the Baptist came baptizing. So he associates that verse with John the Baptist, but he doesn't tell that conversation. He just doesn't have that conversation at all. John's Gospel has more detail about John the Baptist. Well, in the book, Why Are There Differences in the Gospels, which I quoted earlier, Dr. Lacona suggests that John the Evangelist, the author of that gospel, might simply have made that up. He calls it transferal, which would be transferring it from the narrator, not even from another character, to John the Baptist. Maybe John the Baptist didn't say it. And John the Evangelist just kind of made him say it in his story, in a conversation. I don't know whether the idea then is that this conversation took place or not, or what, but it's an unforced error. It's what I call an unforced error, because there is no connection. This isn't even being done because we've got some Bible difficulty. We're saying, oh wow, it looks like these contradict one another. Nothing. It's just, well, it's only in John, who knows, maybe he made it up. That, again, is not functionally treating the document as reliable. This is really important because you will see scholars saying, hey, I think the Gospels are reliable. You will see indignation. There will probably be indignation about this talk because I'm saying that there's any question about whether these scholars are treating the Gospels as reliable. How dare you suggest that they're not treating the Gospels as reliable? Well, gentlemen, you're out there questioning for no reason at all some completely innocuous detail merely on the grounds that it's found only in this document. You must not be treating functionally that document as a reliable source. Because if you were, then again, the fact that it was stated in there would constitute sufficient reason that you wouldn't just put some big question mark over it. If everything has to be double, if we have to double everything, then we're not treating either of them as being highly reliable. Okay. So why should we care? Now we get into the motivating part. I've spent enough time on that, the defining. Why should we care about high gospel reliability as defined here? Because somebody could say, fine, Lydia, that's the way you want to use those words. You're weird. We don't care about that kind of reliability if you're going to use the word that way. Well, frankly, I think that those of you who've been hearing this can kind of see that actually there's nothing particularly strange about the ways that I was defining it. Usually when we say something is reliable, that means you can depend upon it. You can count on it. You can put your weight on it, okay? And I'm trying to get at that by my definitions. But there are approaches to Christianity and to apologetics, which is the defense of Christianity, that tend to imply that this issue is unimportant because we can get people to, allegedly, to be Christians without it. I call this the sinner's prayer approach to apologetics. or the altar call approach to apologetics. That apologetics is just to get people to say, okay, I believe in the resurrection. And it's like, okay, man, that's it. You're going to heaven now. Which I don't actually think is true, by the way. There have been many heretics who have believed in the resurrection. Back in the old days, there were heretics known as Socinians. There were heretics known as Arians. They did not believe Jesus was God. They didn't believe that there was a Trinity. I mean, they weren't Christians. I'm sorry, it wasn't an insult. They just weren't. But they thought that Jesus rose from the dead. But a minimalist approach will say you don't actually need high gospel reliability. Whew. Thank goodness. Okay. There's this feeling of maybe they're not sure they can get it if they're so gosh darn relieved that they don't have to try for it. Well, this is important whether you are or aren't a Christian, because suppose you're not a Christian. Hopefully some people will hear this talk who aren't Christians, and I would definitely tell them to come back for the next 2 weeks for sure, because then I'm going to get into why you should think the Gospels are reliable. But what if they are? What if they're highly reliable? I think that should give you some pause, because they do contain miracles. So if you were a skeptic and you were going to go, stupid, they contain miracles. Why should I believe these are reliable at all? And then you find out that there's reason to think that they are. You should be experiencing some cognitive dissonance here, and it should give you some uneasy nights to maybe start thinking that maybe this cockamamie story turns out to be true after all. It's important because of the defense of the resurrection itself. Historical apologetics, the defense of Christianity, has tended to center on the resurrection of Jesus. It's the central evidential support for Christianity. But we greatly weaken the argument for the resurrection when we abandon gospel reliability in the sense that it's been described here. I have a webinar out there. Please look it up, because I don't want to go over time here too much, which is called Minimal Facts versus Maximal Data Approaches to the Resurrection. I'm just going to be able to touch on that here briefly. One of the reasons that we weaken the argument so much when we abandon gospel reliability is because such arguments usually fall back upon saying, well, a lot of scholars acknowledge appearances. You saw that in that long quotation I gave earlier from Dr. Lacona's book on the resurrection. Well, historical bedrock that there was some kind of appearance experiences. Well, what kind? I'm going to click ahead now, actually, for a minute, and talk about this question of what most scholars really acknowledge. You'd be surprised when you sometimes hear this presentation of the case. A vast majority of scholars across a wide ideological spectrum acknowledge that the disciples had appearance experiences of Jesus. Now, Bart Ehrman is somebody that will often be debated. He's a frequent debate partner set against Christian apologists. Let's see what he says about appearances and what he acknowledges. First of all, he says, I'm not sure there actually were group visions. I think we can say that some individuals had visions of Jesus. They are best attributed to Peter, Paul, and Mary. Peter, Paul, and Mary was a pop group. Anyway, as it turns out, but I'm not sure if the group visions are historically probable. This was in a blog post that Bart Ehrman did. Okay. Now, maybe somebody's just going to say, oh, well, if Bart Ehrman doesn't acknowledge group appearances, then he's just out of step with the vast majority of scholars, so we'll ignore him. Let's see what else he said. This is on this next quote that I'm going to give. You can find if you subscribe to his blog, which I have done, and if you go to the com thread, so it's publicly available, but you have to be a subscriber, if I can put it that way. If you go to the ComBox thread on a particular post, and you find the place where I started asking questions. This was some months ago. He was talking about the group visions, and I wanted to see what he really thought. So I came into that ComBox thread. It was a few years old, but I was pleased. He actually responded. And I said, well, what do you really think about group visions? I mean, if there were, let's suppose there were, what would be the most you would acknowledge? Because you might hear sometimes, when you hear that they acknowledge group experiences, you might think that they mean like the ones in the Gospels. right in the Gospels, they're touching him, he's eating, they can hear him, they've got all these different senses, they can see him, but it's not just visual, right? It's all this stuff is coordinated and they're all together and all that kind of thing, right? And they meet him multiple times too, not just once. Is that what a great majority of scholars acknowledge? Well, and is that even what, if Ehrman said, suppose there were, I think there might have been group visions, what would he be saying? What's the most he would say? And here's what he answered me. Most group experiences involve seeing the person from a distance, but over time, the stories about those appearances get embellished and amplified over time. The stories in the Gospels are not eyewitness accounts written by people who were claiming to be there, but the embellished versions from decades later. But that doesn't mean they weren't rooted in an experience that a group of people claimed to have. Now, suppose someone took that position without the above comment by Ehrman. Suppose someone said, yeah, I think they had a group experience like this that could have involved seeing him from a distance, okay? And it got greatly embellished over time. Guess what? In the surveys that have gone into this vast majority of scholars, that person would count. Bet you didn't know that. Well, I mean, the people who hear about this know that, but if you've never heard my rant, you wouldn't have known that. That when we're counting up statistics, and all the vast majority of scholars admit that, you wouldn't know that that could count people who simply acknowledge, some group of people and they have some vision over there in the sky or something of Jesus, or they're like, oh, there's Jesus, and they're not like having a conversation, they're not touching him or anything. That would count. Now, let's go back here. So that's our with what kind of appearances? Okay, we need more detailed appearances, but with high reliability, we have that. The claims recorded in the resurrection accounts then become very hard to explain, except by a physical resurrection, because otherwise they'd be lying, the conspiracy theory is very likely, and they'd be constructing in these conditions of great persecution these very detailed physical accounts. Okay, so we did that. All right, now, why else is high reliability? I'll go through these a little faster. Support for doctrine. All right? Again, you want somebody to be a Christian, even minimal Christian, even kind of a mere Christian, presumably he's supposed to believe that Jesus is God. Well, if we're saying, I don't know if Jesus' teaching recorded in the Gospels occurred in a recognizable way, I think you're going to have trouble supporting the deity of Jesus. And if you don't have high gospel reliability and you're not willing to defend that, you're going to have trouble defending that Jesus actually taught that he was God. The humanity of Jesus. We have numerous examples, details of the accounts. And I could give citations here, but I don't want to take the time, of scholars questioning these specifics, like that Jesus said he was thirsty on the cross. Okay, that kind of thing. The existence and nature of the Holy Spirit. This is presumably also part of even basic creedal Christianity. What's some of the strongest evidence we have for it? Jesus' teachings in the Gospel of John. But the Gospel of John is one that comes in for a lot of doubt, a lot of question. So how are you going to get your doctrine of the Holy Spirit robustly with the authority of Jesus? How about even just commissioning his apostles? And by the way, the existence and nature of the Holy Spirit are relevant to our doctrine of Scripture, because people are going to defend the New Testament by Jesus' teaching where he said he was going to send his Holy Spirit to inspire them and teach them and bring things to their remembrance. What if he didn't really say that? Jesus' teaching on divorce gets called into question, specifically his clause where he said except for fornication. Jesus' teaching about the Old Testament. I had someone write me, someone who had adopted some views that I've criticized, and said, well, how would you defend a doctrine of the inspiration of Scripture? Can we go through Jesus' teaching that not one thing shall pass from the law until all is fulfilled? And I said, well, I can use those teachings because I think the Gospels accurately record what Jesus taught. I'm not sure you can, because you're trying to do theology over here using Jesus' teachings, but you've accepted these views concerning that they could have added things to what Jesus taught. Being a Christian is about more than the resurrection alone. We use that and we say, okay, if he rose from the dead, then God was endorsing his teaching. Which teaching? What was God endorsing? Preaching and personal devotion. If you're going to plan a sermon, if you're going to be counseling someone, can you take it that the events reported in the Gospels happened more or less as recorded, or do you have to go phone up your friend who's a scholar and say, is this part for real? Can I preach on this part on Sunday? Can Christians meditate on and derive comfort from events in the life of Christ and the teachings recorded, even if they are reported only in one gospel? Okay, what if I want to meditate on no man shall take them out of my hand? That's found in John. Okay, Jesus said, no one shall pluck believers out of his hand. What if I'm worried about my salvation? Okay, and I want to meditate on that. Can I do that? Did Jesus say that? It's only found in one gospel. It's not multiply attested. Is John reliable? So there are ramifications and there are reasons why you should consider this to be important. Now, am I suggesting that we must assume without argument that the Gospels are reliable because we just need it? I mean, everything I've been doing over the last several slides, someone could watch that and go away and say, oh, so she's just clutching her pearls about the idea that these might not be reliable. She's upset. She's distressed. Those conservatives, man, they just can't handle it. Okay, they can't handle it. And I had a Facebook discussion about some differences on this, and someone said, okay, so what you're saying is that we should assume that the Gospels are reliable. We should just assume it. No, I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that. I'm not saying we need this, so grab onto it and hold onto it because your faith is going to be shaken otherwise. No, I'm asking that we recognize the importance of the question. And then I'm going to present arguments that they are reliable. But what I'm asking is that we not say we don't need it, it doesn't matter, it's not necessary, we don't need to get into that, we don't need to saddle ourselves. Very famous book on Christian apologetics that says that Christian apologists do not need to saddle themselves with arguing for gospel reliability like it's a burden. Okay, I'm asking we not say that, and then therefore that we go ahead and joyfully embrace, not saddle ourselves, but joyfully embrace the opportunity to investigate gospel reliability because there is a wealth of evidence for it. And we do that with a recognition that the issue is a matter of vital concern. Okay, come back next time to hear just some of the reasons why we should think that the Gospels are reliable. And if you want to contact me, you can follow me on Facebook. You don't need to be my Facebook friend. You don't need to hear what I had for supper last night, but you can follow my New Testament posts. Sometimes I have posts on other cultural matters, which hopefully won't annoy you too much, but a lot on biblical studies and New Testament, links to new YouTube videos and stuff. You can email me, lydiamcgrew@gmail.com. Please introduce yourself. If you do send me an email, just tell me, a little bit about who you are. And then my author page is lydiamcgrew.com, and you can look up and subscribe to Lydia McGrew on YouTube. I'm actually right now about to start a series on the intersection of gospel reliability and miracle reports on my YouTube channel. And I'm planning that. I've been talking to members of my household about that just today. So I think that's going to be exciting because that's new content of a kind that I've never done before. So at this point, I'm going to, I think, stop sharing. Let's see here. Stop sharing. There we go. Okay, that's for the WebEx. Okay. All right. I'm going to come out here and I'm going to take some questions and answers.
Actually, stay pretty much where you are.
Stay pretty much where I am? Okay, I just need more water.
We give Lydia a little hand. live streamers, bear with us. We're going to switch video inputs for the Q&A time. I think we've got about 15 to 20 minutes of time for questions. So if you have questions for Lydia, send them in the chat and we'll field those and ask her those questions.
And we can also start with the people who are sitting here, right? Presumably. Anybody here? Go for it.
Okay. Hi, I'm Jasmine. Sorry, can you hear me?
Not very well. I do have a hearing problem, and feel free to, yeah, that would be fine. You're distanced.
Hi, I'm Jasmine.
Jasmine.
My question is, how do you show gospel reliability to like a friend or a Christian that has been struggling with their faith?
Right. So definitely come back next week, and the next week too. And what I usually advise, I'm going to give you a lot of ammunition for that purpose. And then what I'm going to advise is that you internalize portions of it that you find especially compelling. And so you don't have to learn all of it, okay? But there are going to be parts that are hopefully going to catch, your attention. And that you'll say, oh, I never thought of that argument before. I never thought of that before. And you, if I can put it this way, memorize a few of those. And then when you're having conversation with that person, or maybe you're talking, virtually or something in chat, you say, well, I heard this great argument the other day, that I had never thought of before about how the Gospels look like real reports of real events, and this is how that went. And give it to them, and just have a few things, in your back pocket that you've come to feel comfortable with. And that's what I recommend, both for yourself and for other people. But there will be different ones, and there's probably things you've never heard of before. I'm hoping that they will be new, kinds of whole classes of argument that we're going to come back to next week. My book, Hidden in Plain View, I think is pretty user-friendly too, and it goes into one of these kinds that's known as the argument from undesigned coincidences, which is this puzzle fitting between the different Gospels. It's a very cool type of argument. It's not the only one. It's only one of the types, but that's available in Kindle pretty affordably. So I'd encourage you to have a look at that at Hidden in Plain View. Got somebody else? Oh, go ahead. Oh, okay. Yes, dear.
Just wanted to point out how important it is that we not insist on multiple attestation in secular history. For example, we learn a great deal from the Germanica of Tacitus that we have from no other source whatsoever. And if we said, oh, there's only one source, so we can't believe any of this, we would be bereft of a great deal of what we know about the Germanic tribes at the time Tacitus is writing. So this is not just a problem that comes up in New Testament scholarship. And the methodological precept that you're urging, that we be willing to take good sources seriously, even if it's the only source, is one that we already follow in good secular history. So this is not some kind of special apologetic-y thing. This is something that we're doing for the sake of good historical work in general.
Absolutely, and in daily life too. I mean, obviously, there are lots of things that you would accept from just one human being, or just one book. Okay, how about if we go to some online questions? Go ahead, Thomas.
Absolutely. So I'm going to kind of combine two here.
Okay.
So one is, how many scholars, Christian scholars, would you say, or what proportion of them are fighting for reliability of the Gospels in your sense? And then, since presumably that's a small number, why do you think there is that resistance? Do they think we just can't show it, given the data? Mm-hmm. But if they think we can, then why are they hesitant?
It's kind of a complicated answer, actually, to that. I think there's actually a pretty large, I can't prove this, but I think there's a pretty large silent majority out there of scholars, and when I say scholars, I mean people who are just like quietly teaching at the seminary level, here in Canada, in overseas, who actually believe in high gospel reliability in the sense in which I'm using it, particularly those that would identify themselves as evangelicals, especially those that would identify themselves as inerrantists. I mean, that gets us into the whole inerrancy issue. Most people who identify as inerrantists, I think, in the main, still think that that entails reliability, right? I mean, it's a very strange hybrid view that you can affirm inerrancy and deny reliability in the sense that I'm giving it here. I think it's actually still relatively new on the scene. But I think they're not famous. You know, I think there are a fair number of people out there who are just, quietly teaching their Greek classes and their New Testament classes and so forth, and they count as scholars, but they're not household names. Now that's just my sense of it. And then I think quite a number of scholars are still, they're sort of your old guard inerrantists, and they're fighting for reliability by way of fighting for inerrancy. Southern Evangelical Seminary is an example of a very staunch inerrantist seminary, for example, that's really still defending that in that sense. And so they're doing it, as you might say, more deductively. They assume inerrancy, and then obviously, my type of, because they assume an old-fashioned kind of inerrancy, not a redefined kind, which I could explain separately. But then my sense of reliability then sort of follows from that all the more so. Okay, so there's actually a fair number of them. I think that these other views are becoming popular among a sort of, I might say, self-styled moderate evangelical group who would think of themselves as not being fundamentalist, but also not being what they consider to be liberal. And so what they consider to be liberal is like way out, way over here. And so they think of themselves as occupying this kind of balanced middle ground. That's where the views that I've sort of brought up a little bit here and critiqued are really taking hold. And even there, I think there are those who still defend reliability. I would say Craig Blomberg definitely still defends reliability in the sense in which I'm using that term quite strongly. But that middle ground is more of a shifting ground from a sociological point of view. It's unclear how many are there and how many aren't. And I'd say there are a lot of social forces there more so than argumentative forces. And I've certainly tried to show that the argumentative basis is not strong for abandoning reliability in the sense that I'm using it. But I'd say there's still quite a number of people who maybe aren't even aware of these changes that have taken place, even among those who would be called scholars. I'll go back to Thomas in a minute because he's probably got more, but are there any other questions here in person? Kevin, you look like you have one.
I had one. Going kind of off of, Tim brought this up in his past question, but I just wondered if you had any more comments or information or data just about like extra biblical sources that work to confirm the gospel accounts and like the standards that we hold secular history to, and how, like, I've kind of heard Christian apologists say that a lot of people hold the Gospels and the New Testament documents to a whole different standard than we do secular history. So just if you had any more to say about
right.
that,
Well, the third week when I do the ACT stuff, I'm going to do a ton of external confirmations, and I'll do some next week as well. But an example, this is like one tiny little example among many, would be that when you go to Luke 3:1, he lists all of these rulers who are rulers at the same time. All right, so you got Pontius Pilate as governor, and
Tiberius.
Tiberius is the Caesar, and I believe it's Philip is Tetrarch of Abilene and Taconitis, and he's got, it's a very detailed list. And you can investigate secular history. You can investigate, Josephus and so forth, and you can find that those people did rule those places at those times. And so that's just one tiny little external confirmation of Luke's tie-in with external history. As far as saying that we hold the Gospels to a standard we don't apply to secular history, there is to some extent truth to that. Unfortunately, what I'm finding in my last few years of research is that a lot of the poor standards are starting to be applied to secular history as well. So like it used to be that you could say, you'd never do this with Plutarch. Well, unfortunately, they are doing this with Plutarch, where you go in there and, you find the historian Plutarch, and if he just says two different things that are different details of an event, and you can perfectly well reconcile them, you'll find scholars, there's a classicist named Christopher Pelling, suggesting that he changed it. And I'm looking at it and I'm saying, but these could both easily be true. There's no problem here. And it's actually rather reminiscent of gospel scholarship, of turning mere differences into heavy literary changes and contradictions. But certainly if we do apply the same standards across the board, and I think legitimate types of standards, we actually find that we can learn a lot more about history that way, both from the Gospels and from secular history. But there are many external confirmations, and one thing I would emphasize with external confirmations of the Gospels is that the little ones are better than the big ones sometimes. So, people will say, well, what secular documents mention Jesus? So what they're looking for, right, is a secular document that specifically mentions Jesus. Now, there are a couple. Or a skeptic will sometimes say, why doesn't any secular gospel or secular document mention the darkness at Jesus' crucifixion? That's one we'll hear, or the slaughter of the babies in Bethlehem. Okay, so they're making an argument from silence here, and there are answers to these. Slaughters of the babies in Bethlehem was probably only a few babies. It was a very small town. Roman historians didn't really give a flip about Bethlehem. Okay, the darkness may not have actually been extremely widespread. It could have been over that region, just all kinds of things. We don't have very many documents from that time, and so forth. So what are they looking for? They're looking for specific mention of specific events that are in the Gospels, where we find somebody over here who's going to mention that same event. That's not the way to go about it. The way to go about it is to look at little things like the references to the temple tax, or the reference to the temple guard, or the reference to the fact that they could punish people but they couldn't kill them, or these kinds of things. The tacit allusion to the tense political situation when they say we have no king but Caesar, when they bring Jesus to Pontius Pilate and they goad him and they say, if you release this man, you are not Caesar's friend. We can investigate that as the backdrop. That kind of indirect confirmation is actually much stronger, because otherwise, if it's just, oh hey, look, there's Herod, he's in the Gospels. Well, those novels that I was talking about before, they have a lot of famous people, in them from history, okay? But they're just novels, okay? You want to talk about something that it's easy to put into a document that you could be making up. A famous person's name is the easiest thing of all to put in there. But walking around and tiptoeing among all of the different extremely complicated social and cultural issues of the day and never getting it wrong in a world without Google or Alexa is much, much harder. And I think we'll see how that works as we go on, in future weeks. Thomas, do you have any more from the online folks?
Has Google not always existed?
I know, right? I know.
That wasn't actually a question on here, but there is a question. How do you feel about using literary devices to explain potential problems in the historicity of the Old Testament?
In the Old Testament, okay. If they are fact-changing literary devices, I think you would have to satisfy a very high burden of proof. It would take a lot to convince me that an Old Testament author was deliberately changing the facts. So this mention of literary devices, not everybody in the audience may know what we're talking about, and I don't want to take a lot of time. I've done a lot of it online. You can look it up. But with literary devices, quote unquote, the ones that I have written against are what I call fact-changing literary devices, which is where an author says, well, I know it happened this way, but I'm going to make it happen this other way in my story. Now, for an Old Testament author that I don't know the guy's name, I don't have the same way of testing his personal commitment to truth, I'm going to have maybe somewhat less evidence than for Luke or John or these guys that I feel like I can really get to know, okay? But I think that we need to have a very high threshold, burden of proof, before we start accusing an author of deliberately changing the facts like that. And so even going into the Old Testament, I would be looking more to say, can this be explained in such a way that the author is narrating at least what he believes to be true? Generally, the very, very strong case, very strong prima facie case, is that if someone is narrating something in a document that he's taking seriously, that he wants other people to take seriously, that he at least believed it was true. Now, we do have liars. We do have people who make stuff up, but we don't have evidence, and here's another thing. Where is the evidence supposed to be that at the time that the Old Testament book was written, there was some widely accepted and understood device such that everyone just understood that the author might make stuff up at random intervals and you couldn't tell that he was doing it and just put it in there very realistically? That's going to be a hard sell. I know of absolutely no evidence for any such socially, culturally accepted fact-changing device at the time that any Old Testament book was written either. If anything, more effort has been made of recent years to argue for the existence of such devices at the time that the New Testament was written, and it's been a colossal failure, as I've argued at great length. So, you know, I suppose if someone wants to try to start all over again and do that with the Old Testament, bring it. But I'm going to be hard to convince of that there as well. Basically, what I think we do when we analyze these things is we get a sense of the slope that has to be climbed evidentially to show that there were such things and that the authors were using such things. Usually, there are far simpler explanations, and I certainly know of no reason to accept that kind of complicated explanation in the Old Testament either. So, but that was a good one. No one's ever asked me that before. Go ahead, hon.
Just to follow up on your earlier remark about the proportion of scholars, I do find it interesting that historically speaking, this kind of questioning of the literary devices, this kind of use of literary devices to cast doubt upon the accuracy in the normal sense of accuracy of the accounts is a newcomer. It's not something that was being done by people in the time, certainly not by people who profess to be taking the Christian religion and the New Testament seriously in the time of Lightfoot or Westcott or some of these other great scholars. So it is really kind of remarkable, if it were true, that we should just have stumbled upon it now. The democracy of the dead speaks.
Well, yeah, let me pick up on that, because someone's going to say, well, whoa, wait a minute, wasn't there already higher criticism, Strauss and that kind of thing, questioning this stuff then? Of course. But those guys didn't claim it was a literary device. They said it was just all, legendary embellishment. They just outright called it false, okay, and didn't have a whole lot of respect for it. What Tim is saying is relatively new, is this mediating position where one is saying, okay, yeah, the author changed that. No, it's not. It didn't really happen that way, but it's all okay because at the time when it was written, it was just accepted to change things like that. So I really have a high view of the Gospels, but I'm just understanding them as they understood themselves. That is what is relatively new. The old higher critics had made no such claim. They made no such claim. And I would add, you can go back to the ancient church father Origen. Now, Origen was an odd duck. Whether you call him a heretic or not, he was certainly eccentric. He was not representative of ancient views of the Gospels. And he does try to say at times that the Gospels cannot be reconciled. I mean, Origen actually thought that there were places where they disagreed and you should not try to reconcile them and you should say this was true in a spiritual sense. But what's interesting is that Origen never once says that that's because of a literary device. He presents his views as his own views. It's his own idea, that we should interpret this spiritually and we shouldn't try to reconcile it. He never says, because after all, come on guys, we all know, like we would do if we said something was a movie. We all know that in movies people sometimes move around events. He never says anything like that. He doesn't give that as a reason. He just gives his own idea that we ought to interpret this spiritually. I think that's very interesting because in some videos this past summer, a video series, dialoguing a bit with some of my criticisms, Dr. Lacona brought up Origen and tried to sort of recruit Origen as an advocate and even implied that Origen knew of these devices. That, I think, would be news to Origen. There's absolutely no evidence that Origen knew of these qua devices. We must distinguish between the idea that he advocated not harmonizing, he advocated spiritually interpreting something or whatever, and the idea that he said, oh yeah, this is known interpretive thing because that's what the audience expects or something. That was not his argument. So that's kind of interesting from the perspective of what Tim was saying about this being a newcomer. So you can go all the way back and not find a single reference to it. Kind of interesting. Okay, do you have more?
I think we have time for one more question.
Yeah, go for it.
So I believe you called it the minimal facts approach, which is not using your higher degree version
Right.
of reliability. And you said it maybe can get you the resurrection, but that's not all it takes to be a Christian. Is that about right?
Well, I'm not sure it's going to be a strong enough argument for the resurrection either.
Okay.
And that's where my minimal facts versus maximal data comes in. And I can talk about that a little more. This is related to the appearances issue.
Okay.
The minimal facts approach, it's sometimes called the minimalist approach, because Dr. Bill Craig doesn't like to call his version of it minimal facts, but it's nonetheless what I would call minimalist, because he includes the empty two in his facts, and then some people who do minimal facts, like Gary Habermas, doesn't include the empty two. Okay, so there are differences, but they bear a family resemblance to one another. When they talk about the appearances, what they try to do is use as their basic fact that the disciples had these appearance experiences in a sense that they claim is granted by this vast majority of scholars. But then the problem is, as I pointed out, in order to get that vast consensus of scholars, you have to water down the appearances. You have to say, well, you would count people, of course, who thought it was a very, very detailed experience, but you would also count people who don't think it was a detailed experience. You would also count people in your nose counting who just think it was maybe a vision at a distance or something like what Ehrman said. And the problem is, if you're gonna make your minimal fact something that all these scholars agree on, they don't all agree on very robust appearances. And I think that makes it really hard to give a robust argument for the resurrection, especially the physical resurrection. If we don't just want some kind of spiritual resurrection, we want to argue that Jesus was actually there in a physical body, then we're going to need the physical details, such as his eating and that kind of thing. So I'm not sure it'll get you the resurrection.
Right.
But even if it did, then it's going to take more than that to be a Christian. Now, there was probably more to the question. I think.
Yeah, well,
go ahead.
You
From
probably
there. I probably touched upon it already.
You did, yeah. What I was going to ask is there any merit to using that minimal facts approach to get the resurrection, and then from that sort of starting point, then go and get the rest of reliability?
Well, I don't think we want to route all of our reliability through the resurrection. I think we want to have arguments for reliability that are independent. Because after all, even if the resurrection happened, that doesn't mean that Jesus said, before Abraham was, I am, right? What if he was a prophet, he wasn't God, God raised him from the dead, and he never even claimed to be God? That could happen, right? That's at least a possible scenario. So we're not going to get the reliability of the rest of these records of Jesus' teaching even from the resurrection. We have what we need is kind of this two thing. We need, God verified who Jesus was and that he was who he claimed to be, And then that means we should listen to his teaching, and over here we have a record of his teaching that's a good, reliable record of his teaching that tells us what we should be believing, since God verified that we should be listening to this guy. And it's kind of what you would need even for a prophet, any prophet, right? You would need some kind of reason to think he's a prophet, whatever that is, some kind of sign or whatever to take him to be a prophet, and then you'd need to know what his message was. Right, you need a good record of his message, so you put together, okay, this guy's a prophet because he did this sign, and this is the message he's come to deliver, therefore we should believe this message. But you need both of those. And I think you need reliability for that idea of Jesus' message. But I also think you need it to have a really robust argument for the resurrection as well. So it's kind of a twofer.
All right.
Cool. Okay, is that good?
Absolutely.
Thank you, everybody, especially.
That's it for